Hello everyone. Well, this is for third year students. We're going today to speak about another important aspect of the Cold War in the United States, and it's about the armament race, also the nuclear arms race, and also this probably led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is supposed to be the most alarming moment of the Cold War. It is a moment when tension between the two blocs came to its highest point, to its climax, if so to speak. And when you can imagine that the world at that moment feared a real nuclear war that could actually destroy the whole planet. Well, the armament race, that's what we're going to speak about today. But I believe the Cuban Missile Crisis, or missile, by the way, missile or missile crisis, is part of that race to arm oneself. And there was a kind of course, race between the two blocs. In the United States, there was the belief that the USSR was way more armed than the United States, and people used to speak about a kind of gap, arms gap, and bomber gap, also in terms of number of bombers and of fighters and military aircrafts, and so the fear of being surpassed and being overcome by the adversary, by the enemy, in terms of weapons, in terms of arms, and it was a real concern on both sides, but mainly on the side of the United States. And then, of course, the reaction was to spend more money, to invest more on armament, on the creation of new arms, on the development in terms of scientific research, etc. Well, when we speak about all this, of course, we're speaking about all sorts of arms, but mainly the most important, of course, type of arms is the atomic bomb and nuclear weapons in general. Well, you know that the atomic bomb was first used in Japan, first used in war, because of course it was tested before that. When we speak about nuclear arms and when we speak about atomic bombs and nuclear bombs, we speak about testing, and also we speak about using those arms in war. The only moment when they were, or the only time when they were really used in war was of course in Japan, when we speak about, of course, the two bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and which led, of course, to the end of the war. But something important in history, you remember when we spoke about the end of the Second World War, and we also spoke mainly about the Potsdam Conference, that conference between the different allies that tried to shape the map of the new world after the fall of Japan and Nazi Germany. At that moment in the conference, there was a meeting between the American president of the time, Harry Truman, and Stalin. And historians say that Truman tried to inform, probably directly or in an indirect way, to inform Stalin about the new weapon, because it was an extremely important, of course, event, the creation of the new weapon, which means, of course, the atomic bomb that was to be used. And reporters say, or historical accounts say, that Stalin at that moment did not really show big interest. He was rather aloof. He was not really interested. Truman thought that it was because of Stalin did not understand the meaning of that new weapon. But later we understand, and historians, of course, explain that later Stalin was not interested because he knew about the project. And so we can trace back this armament race from that time, when, of course, we speak about the United States that developed for the first time the atomic bomb and then used it, and the USSR, which was not an enemy at that time, but later it's going to be, of course, an adversary, was started to think about it, and to also, through espionage and spying, they, of course, also the USSR came to create its own atomic bomb by 1949. And we have to say, if you read, there's a lot of literature on this, we have to say that the USSR succeeded in this only through espionage, through collecting information, through spying. And the atomic bomb in the United States was created by a project called the Manhattan Project. It was a very secret, top secret, really secret project. No one knew about it, and also historians say that even the president only knew about it when he became president, but before that he could not actually. So it was really secret. But and of course, the general public did not know about that, and a lot of officials in the state and the United States did not know about that. However, Stalin knew about that through espionage again. And according to historical accounts, again, it's through the details that were, of course, collected by spies that the USSR succeeded also in creating its own atomic bomb by 1949. And so you see here we start speaking about a real race. So one is inventing something, the other it tries, of course, to emulate him and tries to create another weapon that is as strong or even more powerful than the first, in order to protect itself and in order to guarantee a kind of balance, of course, between the two blocks, between the two powers that were starting to shape in 1945. Well, in the United States, they spoke about different types of bombs, of atomic bombs, and they were nicknamed most of the time. Some of them are called fat boys and little boys and thin man, etc. And according to their content components, because of course if you read a little bit you will understand that the most important component of the atomic bomb is the substance called uranium and also the substance called plutonium. These were, of course, the raw material used in order to create the atomic bomb, and they were of extreme importance. If one country did not produce them, then it had the USSR, for example, did not have in it on its own land these two molecules, but they actually managed to get them from their allies. And also after that there was also the development of another bomb that was even more devastating and more destructive, a lot more destructive, and it's called the hydrogen bomb. It was never used in war, but according to scientists it's much more powerful than the atomic bomb. And now you can see that the fear becomes very real, the fear of destroying the whole planet. And here we speak about this fear on both sides. So the people in the USSR, politicians, decision makers in the USSR and also in the United States are afraid of this. But at the same time, they are afraid of being destroyed. They are afraid of the destruction of the whole planet, but also they need to keep up with their enemy, with their adversary. We have to be as strong as our adversary, but at the same time, we're all afraid of the destruction. So this was, the whole issue about the armament race or the nuclear arms race and the Cold War. I believe one of the most important elements of the Cold War is about weapons, of course. It's a war, so the most important thing is about weapons, and mainly when these weapons are so destructive they could even destroy the whole planet and finish human life on Earth. This is, the atmosphere that you have to start to imagine. It's a lot of tension, a lot of psychological pressure, but at the same time, these two blocks wanted, of course, to be strong and to defend themselves. So after the USSR, it didn't stop at the level of USA and USSR. Other countries also made their best to get their atomic bomb, and you know them. There are just a few countries in the world today who have the atomic bomb, but after USSR, there was also the UK, which developed its own atomic bomb, and then France, China also. Relatively recent event when Pakistan and India also got their own atomic bomb, and they were enemies, of course. And you all know about the Iranian project and the opposition by the United States and the sanctions because of that project, the atomic project, the nuclear project of Iran. They also say that the war on Iraq was also explained or justified by possible nuclear project by Saddam Hussein. So you see the importance of these projects. Israel also has its own atomic bombs and nuclear weapons according to reports. So This was the atmosphere about weapons, and this was the struggle about weapons on both sides. But by the mid 60s, because of the development of these very destructive weapons, by the mid 60s, there was a kind of belief, or a kind, let's say, of theory, because of, as I said, both sides were afraid, each side was afraid of the other, and each side knew that the other side could destroy the whole planet. So there was a kind of theory by politicians and by historians that was called the mutual assured destruction. Mutual assured destruction, which meant that both sides knew that, or each side knew that the other side could destroy the whole planet and could destroy its enemy and the whole planet. So since I know that I can destroy everything, and you know that I, I know that you can destroy me, and you know that I can destroy you. So mutual assured destruction. I know that you can destroy everything in my country, and vice versa. Then, of course, I have to pay attention to this, and I have to take all the necessary measures not to avoid that global war, that comprehensive, that full war in which everyone is going to be destroyed and the whole planet is going to be destroyed. That was the atmosphere and the feeling that was, very common in the during that period, and people spoke in front of such a crisis. Of course, the weapon crisis and this mass destruction, these mass destruction weapons, and this global fear. There was, of course, the United Nations, which was created after the end of WW2. And the United Nations, in addition to other sides, international organisms, tried to find a solution to this, to stop the proliferation, the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Some suggested that we need to create a kind of international institution, a kind of international agency to oversee the spread, the proliferation of such weapons, and to control all the countries in order to restrict the spread of these weapons. Because what if these weapons find their way to all other nations and to dictators, to probably mad dictators, etc. So this was like a movie, but it's real fear. So I said there was the suggestion to create an international agency to control and to oversee the spread of these weapons. There was also another suggestion to stop and to dismantle these nuclear heads and these atomic bombs, to dismantle them, to dissolve them, and to stop them. A lot of suggestions, but in reality nothing really happened, and the race continued, the armament race continued, because by the end no one wanted, of course, the United States, for example. This is something that's very interesting in terms of behavior. The United States has its own nuclear weapons, but at the same time it says, for the sake of safety and for the sake of world peace, they prevent Iran, for example, and they prevent Iraq from having their own nuclear weapons. What about your own weapons? They do not prevent Israel, on the other hand. So it's a very delicate and very politicized issue, the issue of nuclear weapons, as you can imagine. So as I said, all the attempts to control the proliferation of these weapons, I believe, did not really work. And by the end, of course, we have what we have today. Still, there are important nuclear heads and atomic bombs in different countries, big countries, strong countries. And the fear, I believe, is still there. But the only thing that probably prevents us from, or that probably avoids or spares us the whole destruction of the planet, is of course mutual fear again, the mutual assured destruction, mutual I fear you and you fear me, and this is why the planet is still surviving today. I said after USA, USSR, UK, China, France. By the way, France tested its own atomic bomb in Algeria. Many people probably do not know this. So you know, because before speaking about the use of these atomic bombs, as I said, in wars, there should also be the testing of that, but if it works or not. And this, of course, happened in all countries. China did its own, the USA did its own in the desert, and all countries. But France, for example, tested it. For example, the UK tested, because of course these are small, not like the USA. USA is a very large country. Russia, the same thing. But UK and France are not very large countries, so there's a problem where to test these weapons. And the UK tested it in an area near Australia, very far away from the homeland. And France tested its own nuclear weapon in Algeria, which is a very large country, also, as you know. So within this atmosphere, as I said, of fear, of great fear, we are going to reach the climax of this tension when the possibility of using these weapons becomes very real. We are speaking here, of course, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba, what's the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Very briefly, a very brief introduction. It's when the USSR, which is a communist country, of course, Cuba had become a communist country, and the USSR decided to place nuclear missiles and weapons in Cuba, to place them in Cuba, and in order to be used, I don't know. So this was the fear, I mean, that was created. It was the issue was discovered by the United States through espionage, again through spying. They discovered that there was a project to place a number of of nuclear heads, of course, in Cuba, and these, of course, weapons came from the USSR, and here started the Cuban Missile Crisis. So on the 14th of October in 1962, the USA discovered through espionage again that there was a project, a nuclear project in Cuba. And this project, of course, was in its probably early stages, and they discovered that there was the construction of certain platforms, missile platforms in Cuba, to be used for nuclear weapons. And so on the 14th of October 1962 started this crisis, when of course the whole world, of course, entered into a great panic because of the possibility of launching a nuclear war in the world. The crisis ended by the 28th of October of the same year, so it only lasted 2 weeks, or less than 2 weeks, after a lot of negotiations between the two sides, between USSR and USA, but USSR with Cuba also. So before I speak about this, let me first of all speak a little bit about Cuba, because of course we have to know what Cuba is. Cuba is an island. It's a part of the Caribbean Sea, and very close to other countries that probably you heard about, like Haiti, like the Dominican Republic, Jamaica. This is what we call the Caribbean Sea, and Caribbean, by the way, Caribbean countries. And so Cuba, these countries, by the way, most of them are Spanish-speaking countries, like Cuba itself. And these countries, Cuba, let's only speak about Cuba. Cuba was part of the Spanish Empire always, from the discovery that started by Christopher Columbus in 1492. You remember, of course, Christopher Columbus came to the American continent, and mainly in an area close to Cuba, the Dominican Republic, I think. And then, so these were the first discoveries of the New World before the mainland. And for centuries, Cuba was under the Spanish Empire until the late 19th century, when I said Cuba was mainly dominated by Spain, by the Spanish Empire. And what happened in the late 19th century, there was a war between the USA and the Spanish. And it was a general war, but mainly also it took place in Cuba between the Spanish and the American. And the aftermath, or let's say the result of this war, was the independence of Cuba. It's from that time that we could speak about the independence of Cuba. But Cuba, when by the end of the 19th century, but when Cuba became independent from Spain, it remained, however, under the great influence of the United States of America. By the way, geographically speaking, Cuba is very close to America. It's very close to Florida, mainly, if you know the map. And it's very close to America. It's a small country, very close to a big country, large country, called the United States of America. And then the United States of America played an extremely important role in liberating Cuba from the Spanish, with the help, of course, of internal rebellion by the people, of course. But from that time on, Cuba remained under great influence of the United States. And when we say great influence, I believe, at least on both levels, on two levels at least. At the political level, of course, when it comes to decision making, when it comes to the president and the ruler of the country, who was usually dictated, imposed by the United States. But also the political decisions was mainly influenced by the United States. But on the economic level, the other level is the economic level. And when in terms of property, for example, in terms of companies, big companies that were owned by American citizens in Cuba, but also Cuba is a very rich land producing sugar, producing tobacco. Of course, you all know the Cuban cigar and the Havana, the capital of Cuba. But all these were dominated by the Americans. So I said there was a great influence, American intervention in Cuba on the political level, but on the level of political decision making, but also on the economic level. A lot of property belonged to Americans in Cuba. And of course, you know that the economy was mainly a liberal economy. And then now, so this remained, of course, from the end of the end of the 19th century until the revolution that's going to take place in Cuba. And you, of course, all know about the revolution of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. And this was, of course, a communist revolution. So this happened mainly when Castro came to power. It was in 1959. There was a war that took place for many years against a dictator who was called, the name is very famous, his name is Batista, the General Batista, who was a dictator, and he was an ally of the Americans. Then there were a lot of political troubles and rebellions here and there on the island. And then came a movement, a revolutionary movement led by Fidel Castro, but he was also joined by Che Guevara, etc. And by the end, there was war, civil war, in terms of guerrilla war against the state, against the regime. And by the end, Fidel Castro came to power in 1959. Well, here you can imagine what is going to happen on the level of the economy and on the level of politics. So a communist revolution, of course, meant firstly the nationalization of property. Nationalization, which is the opposite of privatization, which means, of course, when the state decides to buy, sometimes to confiscate property, individual property, private property, and to make it owned by the state. This happened, of course, on a large scale in Cuba in the beginning, as I said, after the communist revolution, and this, of course, did not please American capitalists. It goes without saying. So now this was a radical change, a radical transformation of the relationship between USA and Cuba, of course. Cuba, that I said, of course, was always under the influence of the American economy and the influence of America in general. So after this, of course, the United States is going to react. And I am speaking here exactly about the period before the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're speaking about the, let's say, the causes and the things that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the reaction of the United States here, of course, you can imagine, is going to be in the form of intervention in Cuba. So in the beginning, there was the decision to actually impose economic sanctions on Cuba, what was also called the embargo, which meant, of course, a series of economic sanctions, economic restrictions on Cuba, which was very dependent on the United States, of course. But there was also an attempt to intervene, I mean, militarily in Cuba. What you have to know, even until today, in Florida, which is very close to Cuba, there are thousands and probably tens of thousands of Cubans living there. So because historically, every time something political happens in Cuba, people who belong to the opposition, who they go and they run away to Florida. And so the thing that happened was also an important event that took place before the Cuban Missile Crisis was called the Bay of Pigs invasion, or the Bay of Pigs operation. What was the Bay of Pigs? It's a place on the Cuban island, and there was something called the Bay of Pigs invasion, or the Bay of Pigs operation, or incident, or event, or anything. What was this Bay of Pigs event or Bay of Pigs invasion? It was when, with the help of the USA and with its agencies like the CIA, a number of paramilitaries, or rebels, if so to speak, who were against Fidel Castro and his regime, and they were mainly based in Florida. They were prepared mainly with the help, as I said, of the American government, to invade Cuba. And of course, the idea, of course, was to again to dismiss the new regime that was, of course, established there, the communist regime, and to of course to perform a coup against Fidel Castro. So this was a failure. So just to say this in the very beginning. So as I said, paramilitaries who were collected and trained and then armed, and then they sailed, by the way, not from Florida. They sailed from Latin America, from Guatemala and from also Nicaragua, and then they landed on the island, the Cuban island, on the southwest west of the island. And this was mainly in 1961, between the 17th of April and the 20th of April. So please, you have to remember this. This was what we call the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it was a failure, which meant that it was defeated by the regime, by Fidel Castro, who took the command himself. He actually participated in the fights himself as the leader of his own army. And you can, by the way, because this is recent, in the 1960s, you can find a lot of videos about real videos. Not acting, but real videos about what happened during the Bay of Pigs invasion. So as I said, this invasion was defeated. It was stopped in just 4 days by the regime, but this incident actually caused a lot of embarrassment to the United States of America, because of course the world knew that the United States of America was behind that. But historians say that even during the invasion itself, which means during those days, the 4 days, between 3 and 4 days, the United States, although it was behind that action, it did not engage fully in the invasion because of embarrassment, because of critics and people who were going to say, how come you intervene in the internal political affairs of another country? And some historians explain the failure of this invasion by the absence of full engagement by the Americans. So you see that the tension here is becoming more and more strong, and then just before 1962 and before the 14th of October 1962, when I said, of course, the Cuban Missile Project was discovered by the Americans through espionage, there was also another thing that played a role in this increase of tension, which was the fact that, like the USSR, before the USSR decided to place and to deploy these missiles in Cuba, the United States, of course, placed also missiles, nuclear weapons, in other countries very close to the USSR, mainly in Turkey, but also in Italy. Turkey is, of course, if you see in the map, is very close to the USSR. So before the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States also placed and deployed a number of missiles, nuclear missiles, in these two countries, which led, of course, the USSR to think about doing the same thing. But here, this time, of course, Cuba is so close, extremely close to the United States. So here, historians say that this decision to deploy these weapons in Cuba was on the request of the Cuban leader Fidel Castro, but also, of course, the USSR, and it was led at that time by the Russian leader, by the Soviet leader Khrushchev. Also, of course, agreed to do this. And this, as I said again, after two things, two important events. First, the communist coup or the communist revolution that toppled down the General Batista, the dictator of Cuba, and which announced, of course, a communist regime with nationalization, etc. That's one important thing. And then, of course, it caused a radical change and radical transformation of the Cuban-American relations. And then the second important thing is the Bay of Pigs invasion, and which is, again, although of course it was performed by by the Cuban opposition, by Cuban opponents to the regime, but of course it was mainly orchestrated by the Americans, and with the support of the Americans. Otherwise, it could not have happened. So. What we have to say that these were mainly the two things that took place before the missile crisis started. But also, in addition to that, another reason, as I said, is the placement of nuclear weapons very close to the USSR. This is part in Italy and in Turkey. This is part of the geopolitical war, the geopolitical strategies of these countries. I told you, I remember in the very beginning of this course on the Cold War, that Cold War also meant, of course, it meant a psychological war, it meant an armament race, but also meant geopolitics. We, for example, before engaging in war, before we really fight, before we really try to kill each other, we start to position our pawns like on a chessboard. You position your pawns before the real fight starts. And this positioning of the pawns, of the weapons, of course, means when you place your weapons in Turkey, in Italy, and me, I place my weapons in Cuba, which is very close to you. So this is part of the chess game. So you see, and this is, of course, something that would make tension increase. So this was mainly the main motivation for the USSR, not for Cuba itself. The main motivation for the USSR is to do the same as you. Since you place your weapons in Turkey, I do that. Well, what we have to say, as I said, is that the crisis only lasted less than 14 days, and by the 28th of October it was over. But what happened during these 14 days? First of all, it was President Kennedy in the United States at that time, and upon discovering this, upon being informed of this, he ordered a blockade around the island Cuba, blockade by warships, which means a kind of siege. It's a modern siege, you know, like the Trojan siege, the siege of Troy. This is, of course, a technique in war. It's to put your enemy under siege, and this is what happened for the Cuban island at that time. It was a total blockade, a total siege by sea, and in order to prevent any more weapons to come into the island. And then there was a long series of negotiations between the two blocs, between USSR and United States. This is, of course, what led to the solution by the end, to the end of the crisis on the 28th of October. And then, after long negotiations, the decision was taken by the USSR, after negotiations, of course, to withdraw and to dismantle all missiles that were deployed in Cuba. On the other hand, the declared promise or commitment on the side of the US was not to intervene in Cuban affairs anymore. That was what historians say today. But also, so there was something that was not declared at that time, but was actually discovered later. It was also the dismantling of American weapons in Turkey after that. So, just in conclusion, I'd like to say, as I said in the beginning, this was probably the most important and most alarming moment of the Cold War, really, because, as I said, the tension and the fear came to its climax. But of course, as like in a classic tragedy, tension starts to rise, and then we reach climax, and then there is a kind of fall of tension. I'm not only speaking about, of course, the downfall of the hero, of course, in a classic tragedy, but there was a fall of tension after reaching the climax of tension. And indeed, you see, how history is also very similar to a classic tragedy. After this event, and there were some other events after it, of course, but by the beginning of the 1970s, there was a kind of détente. The French word détente, which means, of course, fall of the tension. And when, of course, fear becomes very minimum and tension becomes very minimum. Like in classic tragedy, we speak about denouement. Both are French words, by the way, denouement and détente. Denouement in the end of a classic tragedy, which means, of course, after the downfall of the hero and after the fall of tension, etc., that feeling and that impression that everything is over. But of course, this is not the case here. It's not denouement, it's détente. Détente means, of course, a moment of decrease in tension, decrease in fear, and relative normalization of relationship. During this détente, by the way, it was not really normal relations between USSR and USA, but relatively normal. Like, for example, trade was restored between both blocs, and negotiations and debates, normal debates, etc., and agreements, etc. But this did not, of course, last forever, as you know. So this was about the Cuban Missile Crisis and its significance in the history of the Cold War. And that's it. Thank you very much.